private capital kind of encapsulates a whole bunch of different asset classes. So I know it's definitely not one size fits all, but from an overview perspective for the last financial year, what was the kind of outcome for the sector?
Well, look, private capital's been attracting interest all over the world, and we've seen that even during the height of the pandemic, Kylie. Even during our low points from an economic point of view, we were seeing huge demand from investors all over the world who want access to private markets. And really, that's what private capital delivers. It's a number of different sub-strategies. It might include, for example, private equity, venture capital, unlisted property, unlisted infrastructure. All of those strategies essentially make up the universe of private markets. And we've seen significant growth over the last 12 months. In fact, as at the end of 2020, we saw around 77 billion of capital under management here in Australia alone. And that's a significant uplift on where we've been over the past few years.
How does that compare to public markets?
Well, public markets are a significantly larger base of capital. You're talking about trillions of dollars versus something like $77 billion. But the really important point here is that increasingly businesses are choosing to stay private. They're not choosing to list on the share market as frequently as perhaps they used to. And so that means you're seeing right now, and you will see a lot more over the years to come, significant value creation, significant new economic activity coming out of private markets. And I think that's what's really exciting about this space.
Okay, so the yearbook, a very interesting year. We've sort of half of it's covered in life, pre-COVID, hard to remember. And the other half was, right in the thick of it all. Did you see any trends or any shifts sort of as we transitioned from that, former life into the new way of living?
Absolutely. So I think what has become apparent during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic now, certainly in Australia's case at least, we're coming out the other side of this dark tunnel, is a significant interest in the role of technology, the role of innovation in growing economies and allowing us all to continue to function. In fact, if we think through to the low points of the pandemic, we were only able to continue to do our job through technology and innovation. And so institutional investors, other non-institutional investors, such as family offices, here in Australia, self-managed super funds, high net wealth individuals, all of those investors are now turning their sights on allocating capital into this part of the market and allocating capital into areas where they know technology and innovation will increasingly play a role from an economic viewpoint.
Okay. I want to dive into venture capital in particular, a very strong year for that vertical. Would you say it was a bit of a structural shift in there? I mean, we talked a lot in the early days of COVID about this kind of weight of money argument. Does that hold, or is it something deeper than that?
Well, I think the venture sector delivers the sharp edge of that innovation and technology opportunity set that I was just touching on, Kylie. And so, yes, we have seen venture attract records amounts of new capital in the past 12 months. We've seen, I think, $1.3 billion in new capital raised here in Australia alone. And to give you a very simple data point by way of comparison, 6 or 7 years ago here in Australia, Kylie, we raised about $150 million of new venture money. So you're talking about an exponential rate of growth over the past decade. And that's really important because we know that venture will catalyse that innovation and technology growth that we need to see right across all sectors of our economy. Venture is at the sharp end of delivering on that investment opportunity.
And also strong flows coming in from international investors into Australian venture funds. What is it about the environment here that's allowing that?
Clearly, on a global scale, Australia is highly attractive to investors all over the world now, and I think that's a real positive. We haven't necessarily always seen that play out over years past, and so Australia now sits right at the top of the pecking order when it comes to any investor, particularly institutional investors in other markets around the world. They're looking for a stable place to invest, a place to invest where the economy is still growing, and Australia delivers on that.
Private equity, another one of the verticals that you cover, growth there for the 4th consecutive year. What's kind of driving that? Is it really lumpy, big deals for some of the big names, or is it just sort of growth across the board?
Look, it's primarily growth across the board, but yes, of course, private equity does, of course, sometimes experience these periods where you get big, significant multi-billion-dollar transactions which have a big bearing on the overall numbers over a 12-month period. And we saw that over 2020. The most significant of the deals completed last year, of course, as we all know, was the investment into Virgin Group here in Australia by Bain Capital. That was really significant. That makes up a very sizable part of the overall investment base here for that calendar year. But I think we're seeing growth in other sectors as well across private equity. We're seeing growth in the SME market. We're seeing growth into businesses that are in financial distress through no fault of their own, other than perhaps the impact of the pandemic on their capacity to operate and to deliver profits. So you are seeing significant opportunities right across the spectrum.
This report produced in partnership, you have a data and analytics partner in Preqin. I'd like to bring in the Preqin CEO, Mark O'Hare now, who's joining us from London. Mark, is the outcome for Australian private capital, you've done all this research, but you obviously look at these places right around the world. Is it consistent with the performance of the private capital industry globally?
Great question. Look, on the one hand, what we're seeing in Australia is consistent with what's happening globally. On the other hand, it does demonstrate the strength and resilience of the market in Australia. So in a very difficult year, AUM, assets under management in Australian focused private equity, grew by 8.4%. Actually, the global picture also grew, particularly in the second half of 2020, but Australia's growth was particularly strong. What's really impressive, what we're seeing in Australia, is the strength of new fundraising. Australia's demonstrated itself as a very attractive destination for capital. Returns have been good, but also it's a very favourable environment. That's stable government, stable legislation, and it's a business friendly environment. So fundraising in Australia was a remarkable 8.3 billion Aussie dollars, and that's a significant growth on the previous year. And our view is that demonstrates the maturity and depth and breadth of the ecosystem in Australia. So it's a great story.
Mark, how's the COVID-19 pandemic created opportunities for private capital on a global scale?
Some predictable things happened, and some predictable things didn't happen during the pandemic. The first thing that has happened is it's been actually a very supportive environment for venture capital. I think the pandemic accelerated many of the technological e-commerce, virtual engagement trends that were well underway, but accelerated them to a remarkable degree. And through that, we've seen a very strong, year for venture capital. As I said, the Australian venture capital industry had a tremendous year, but that's been mirrored around the world. So that's one thing that was probably predictable and absolutely has happened.
And so to what extent do you think we'll see the size of these deals continue to grow?
Companies are managing to be funded by private capital for longer in their life cycles. Investors, be that sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, endowments around the world, are increasing their allocations to private equity and private capital. So they're putting more money to work because of the good returns. And as a result, private equity is being able to invest in and transform, bigger businesses and bigger assets. So the trend towards larger deal sizes will absolutely continue over the medium to longer term. And another way of looking at that is that private equity and private capital, run by some of the leading Australian firms as well as global players, will have an even bigger role to play in the Australian economy in years to come.
Mark O'Hare from Preqin, thank you for your time. And Yasser El-Ansary from the AIC, thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Collie.
Get your copy of the Preqin and Australian Investment Council's 2021 Yearbook at aic.co/yearbook.